my God, what happened?
Oh, Joey was born, and then 28 years later, I was robbed.
Dr. Sanjay Gupta, cardiologist and heart specialist, thank you so much for your time today. Over the weekend, beloved actor Matthew Perry died, and there were no drugs discovered at the scene and no indications of foul play. Professionally speaking, what is the likely cause of death for a 54-year-old man who was found in his spa?
The most likely, I mean, we've got to remember that whilst Matthew was in the public eye, the most important thing, the most common cause of death in middle-aged men is heart attacks, sudden heart attacks. So, you know, if someone said, as a betting man, where would you put your money for middle-aged men to drop down dead or die suddenly? It's usually sudden heart attacks. And often they don't actually give you a warning. So the first warning is the sudden death. And this is one of the big problems with this kind of thing, because if you don't have a warning, then how do you do something to try and avoid that eventuality from happening?
The actor claimed to have been an alcoholic since the age of 14. In those early years of adolescence, what kind of long-term damage would that do to his growth?
I'm sure lifestyle plays a big role, not just the alcohol, but also the stresses. And Matthew, unfortunately, had problems with his weight and prescription medications, as far as I'm aware as well. So all these things will contribute. They're all very inflammatory to the body. And we know that heart disease is a consequence of chronic inflammation. So I'm sure that that plays a role. But of course, there are other things as well. You know, genetics play a role, age plays a role. And generally, there are lots of other things that we regard as normal day-to-day living, which could also contribute. So things like sugar in food, you know, processed, ultra-processed foods. So I'm sure everything contributes. The reality is we will never know, unfortunately. But I think the most likely mechanism in someone like this is a sudden heart attack that would have caused him to develop a heart rhythm disturbance, caused him to die that way. That would be the most likely thing.
Matthew Perry said that 4 years ago, at the age of 49, he nearly died when his colon burst. What kind of state does your body need to be in for that to occur?
Whilst we would like to explain everything through bad lifestyle, I'm sure lifestyle is only a portion of the whole story. So you're right. I mean, you know, depending on what kind of lifestyle he'd led, what kind of medications he'd taken, what kind of toxins he'd put in his body, he would be a lot more vulnerable. But I think that this kind of thing happens to people who lead a good lifestyle as well. You know, we hear athletes drop down dead suddenly of heart attacks. And the problem is that we want to be able to explain things. We want to be able to say, okay, we know why this happened. And often we don't. And this is why it is important when you have a situation like this that a rigorous postmortem is carried out. And not only to try and explain Matthew's death, but also to allow us to get more of an insight into why things are happening. Unfortunately, these days, postmortem are not done rigorously. They're largely done to exclude the possibility of foul play. So, you know, as you say, he had a postmortem, they've excluded foul play, they've excluded toxins. But what else? What else have they done? Have they actually gone and been more rigorous and tried to work out exactly what this mechanism of death was? That is so, so important, because if you look at it, the most devastating thing that can happen is someone who looks apparently well and they're found dead. Unfortunately, very little research is done on those people because it's a post-mortem diagnosis. A lot of the research that comes out from people who make it into hospital. You know, they go into hospital, they survive, and they participate in research trials. But those people who drop down dead suddenly, there's not much research that comes out, and therefore we don't know, we don't have an accurate assessment of exactly how many people die of what. And because we don't have that, there's not much research carried out to try and see whether we can identify what the etiology is. But I think in all likelihood, it's going to be a sudden heart attack.
Reports have indicated that Matthew Perry spent around $9 million battling his addiction between 15 stints in rehab and 12 surgeries. What does the stop and start approach to taking drugs as opposed to going cold turkey do to your heart?
It's hugely inflammatory, particularly with drugs. A lot of them are stimulants. They make the heart work harder, but at the same time, certainly things like drugs like cocaine, stuff like that, they're incredibly harmful to the heart, because it is, on one side, you're making it more difficult for the heart to pump blood out, and at the same time, you're asking the heart to work harder. So in some ways, it's a little bit like having one foot on the brake and then pressing the accelerator really hard on your car. And you can imagine what that would do to the car engine. That I think is, there is absolutely no doubt that addiction is a bad thing, and particularly when it's chronic addiction, which is interspersed by attempts to give up and then taking on. There is no doubt that ages the body very quickly. So I'm sure that is a contributor into what has happened. The question is, what was the final pathway, given everything that has resulted in this happening on this day at that time? What happened there? Now, you may turn around and say, well, he did something at that time that resulted in him dying, but they haven't found anything to suggest that there and then. If they'd found traces of drugs and alcohol and all that, that would be a different matter. So I think that whatever his lifestyle has contributed in a big way to his body aging and getting more ravaged, but then something else happens on top of that, which may have been a consequence of long-term inflammation. But in all likelihood, it was a heart rhythm disturbance or a blockage in his heart arteries that has done this.
When you've spent a big chunk of your life addicted to drugs and alcohol, is there any way of rectifying the damage it's done to your body, or is a heart attack a likely case scenario at some point?
I think unfortunately, you can't reverse, you can't undo, the harm, but you can certainly stabilize it, and you can certainly stop exacerbating it by modifying lifestyle. So unfortunately, this is chronic inflammation. So the difference, and I don't know whether your viewers may appreciate this, but I'll explain it. So there is one thing which is called acute inflammation. Acute inflammation is like me taking a knife, cutting my skin with my knife, and you will imagine that my skin will get red and indurated and horrible. But then if I leave it alone, it will heal. And after a few months or years, it'll just be a tiny scar there and nothing else. Chronic inflammation is not like that. Chronic inflammation is like a toothbrush, someone taking a toothbrush and grating it gently against your skin every day. And if you do that for 20 years, the unfortunate thing is that will never heal. Right? Because you are continuing to insult the area and you're triggering off irreversible changes in the skin. So when people do that, when they have chronic inflammation, the skin will always it'll always flare up. If you touch it, it will leak, etc. So unfortunately, with chronic exposure to toxins, you do trigger off irreversible abnormalities. But again, it's never too late to stop. It's always a good idea to stop whenever you can, because that stops further change, deleterious change to the blood vessels.
With there being a culture of celebrities dying so young from drug use, what sort of damage do you have to be doing to your heart at such a young age to cause death?
I think with drugs, particularly cocaine and stuff, you are causing premature heart disease. And often some of these drugs, what they do is they may not even have enough time to trigger off chronic inflammation, but they can cause the blood vessels to go into spasm. So a lot of heart attacks occur because the blood vessel is progressively getting narrowed and blocks off, and the blood can't get through to the heart. Part of the heart dies, the person goes into a heart rhythm disturbance, and eventually drops down dead. But with things like cocaine, drugs like cocaine, you can develop intense spasm. That's why you will see that people who've been doing long-term cocaine addiction will get perforated nasal septa. They get perforations in their nose because their blood vessels constrict due to a as a consequence of the cocaine. So the same is happening in your heart arteries. You are causing sudden constriction. And if that is maintained, the blood doesn't go through, the heart goes without blood. And therefore, that can trigger off a heart rhythm disturbance. And those are the people who are young, who you will find dead after a bout of heavy cocaine and alcohol, etc. That's what's happening there. So you've not done enough to cause chronic inflammation, although if you do it long enough, you will, but you can also cause sudden spasm of the blood vessels.
The fluctuation of Matthew Perry's weight is evident during his time on Friends. At some points, he's very skinny, which indicated that he was taking painkillers. And then there were times where he's carrying too much weight, which means he was drinking too much. What does this fluctuation of weight, coupled with abusing drugs and alcohol, do to the body?
Yeah, it's horribly, it ravages the body, those fluctuations, sudden changes. You want a nice equilibrium. The body doesn't like too much change very quickly, and particularly when it is all harmful. So, weight gain is inflammatory, carrying the extra sort of fat can be very inflammatory. And then, of course, sudden, when he loses the weight, that's telling you that there's a lot of inflammation going on in the body. So absolutely, there's no doubt that some of it has just been due to all the struggles that he'd faced with his health. It is all horrendously unfortunate. We see this all the time. We see people who are sort of famous rock stars, musicians who lead that kind of rock and roll lifestyle, and that's what happens to them. They are not uncommon for people to die young. In some ways, Matthew is no different to that. But then you have to say, well, there are lots of rockers who go on till they're 80. Well, why him? Why not others? And therefore, there may be that unquantifiable, unexplainable bit that says, okay, this guy, because I suspect he wasn't going through, lots of people go through those health struggles, particularly in showbiz. But why him? Why at the age of 54 compared to some of the rock stars that have gone on till 70, etc.? I'm sure that there's a genetic influence. And there may be other things that we don't know about.
Dr. Sanjay Gupta, thank you so much for your time today.